Neva Civilis, Director of Public Engagement for the Michigan Department of State. My Vote Counts is a weekly series that aims to empower Michigan residents by sharing the most current information regarding the voting and election laws in our state. Today's topic of discussion will be absentee voting counting boards. Joining me to help facilitate our discussion is resident legal expert Megan Shar, Associate Legal Director of the Department of State. And before we begin, just a reminder, if you have any questions at any time during this presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we will try to answer them at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let's begin. The first thing you should know about anything voting in election in the state of Michigan is michigan.gov/vote. This is our one-stop shop to all things voting, election. This is where you can register to vote, update your registration. You can ask for and track your absentee ballot. You can view a sample ballot, your sample ballot, and you can also find your local clerk information. So again, this is a very important website for everyone to remember, michigan.gov/vote. Now, as a reminder, Tuesday, November 8th, what day is that? That is the date of Michigan's statewide general election. Very important to remember, Tuesday, November 8th, Michigan's statewide general election. We do have some other important dates we want you to remember. In addition to November 8th, we want you to remember Monday, October 24th. That's the day you should register to vote online at michigan.gov or by mail. We also are recommending that that's the date that you request an absentee ballot to avoid potential for mailing delays. And also it's the recommended date to return absentee ballot by mail to avoid potential mailing delays. In addition, we have some other dates for you. Friday, November 4th by 5 p.m. That is the deadline for you to request an absentee ballot to be mailed to you. And also Monday, November 7th through 4 p.m. From now until November 7th through 4 p.m., you may vote early in person with an absentee ballot at your city or township clerk's office. In addition, on election day, by 8 p.m., return your signed absentee ballot by hand to your local clerk's office or drop box. And you can register to vote in person that day at your city or township's clerk's office. Now, at this point, I will turn over the presentation to Megan Shar, and she's going to talk about counting absentee ballots. Megan.
Perfect. So we're going to start with going over how absentee ballots are counted. It's important to remember that absentee ballots cannot be counted until election day. This is a state law prohibition, so there is no pre-processing here in Michigan per state law. There are even some restrictions for preparing absentee ballots for processing prior to the day of election. So the clerks and election officials are rather limited in what they're able to do prior to election day. Authorized trained election officials can begin counting absentee ballots when the polls open at 7 a.m. on election day. The counting of absentee ballots occurs either at a polling place or at a separate absent voter counting board, which we'll refer to as an AVCB, Absent Voter Counting Board. What are absent voter counting boards? These boards tabulate absentee ballots for one or more precincts. They're separate from your polling place, and each must use its own poll book, ballot container, and tabulator. Can we go? Okay. The absent voter counting boards report their election results by precinct, and they report them independent of polling places. So a lot of times this may occur after a polling place has already reported their results. We'll get more into that later. Absent voter counting boards also produce individual precinct ballot summaries and statement of votes. And we haven't referred to this before, but an absent voter is one who casts their vote using an absentee ballot. So the way we refer to these counting boards is an absent voter counting board, and they're just counting those absentee ballots that were submitted. How are these counting boards established? The decision to establish a counting board rests with the city or township and the election commission. So some of the reasons that a city or township may choose to establish an absent voter counting board are to ease the demand on election staff on election day, to lessen the impacts of limited space at polling places by instead providing a larger and separate workspace, and to provide additional election workers to process large volumes of absentee ballots. If a counting board is established, the election commission must appoint a minimum of 3 election workers to each counting board. Are these absent voter counting boards required? No, they're not. Cities and townships don't have to establish an absent voter counting board. In fact, a majority do not use them. It's typically your larger jurisdictions that choose to establish these counting boards. Jurisdictions that don't elect to establish an absent voter counting board will tabulate absentee ballots at the polling places where individuals are going to vote on election day. The polling places process absentee ballots the same way as they do a standard ballot, one that you might vote in person. The ballots are tabulated at the polling location by precinct throughout election day. Again, they can start that process at 7 a.m. on election day. How do absent voter counting boards work for those jurisdictions that do decide to establish them? Well, absentee ballots that are received by the local clerk's office before 8 p.m. on election day are securely delivered by authorized election officials to the absent voter counting board for processing and counting. So they're delivered by those election officials to be tabulated at the count board. The ballots are processed, meaning the voter is verified as registered in the e-poll book and the signatures compared to the signature on file. That process takes place at the clerk's office before the ballots are delivered to the count board in most cases. Once the absentee ballot return envelope is opened at the count board, the ballot number is recorded in the e-poll book and matched to the ballot mailed out by the clerk's office. So they want to make sure the individual is returning the same ballot that the clerk's office issued to them, and that is all recorded in the e-poll book. The ballot is then removed from the secrecy sleeve and fed into the tabulator and counted. This is the same process that happens at an in-person polling place if you were to go vote. The ballot's fed in the exact same manner. And then all ballots are stored in a secure ballot container closed with a numbered seal before being securely transported by an authorized election official to the local clerk's office for storage. What equipment is used at the absent voter counting boards? This is similar to what you see for polling places, and the city or township clerk is responsible for making sure that both the polling places and these absent voter counting boards have the proper equipment, and that includes the tabulators used for scanning and counting the votes, and then the absent voter poll book in the case of an absent voter counting board. Some absent voter counting boards also use the e-poll book as an additional level of verification. So they may have the absent voter poll book and the e-poll book at the counting board. And as is the case with all polling locations, the tabulators are not connected to the internet. The computers are not. This is all downloaded before election day for use. Who is present at an absent voter counting board? So there's a few key players to keep in mind. The city or township clerk will be there, or they will have an appointed election inspector to supervise the counting of absentee ballots. So if the clerk is not there themselves, they will have appointed a supervisor to keep an eye on the processes being used at that absent voter counting board. There are also election inspectors or election workers. We use those two terms interchangeably. And they're responsible for doing the actual work. They're processing and tabulating all of the absentee ballots that came in and were transported to the counting board for counting. The clerks and the election commission have to appoint at least one election worker from each major political party for each precinct. So they have to have a total of 3 election workers there, and there must be at least one from each major political party. You may also see election challengers at the absent voter counting board, just like you might see them at your local polling place. And if they have good cause, they're able to challenge the processes being used for counting absentee votes. You also have election observers, or poll watchers is another term that we may use, and they cannot challenge the processes, but they're able to view how these votes are being counted in the absent voter counting board. Finally, you've got a challenger liaison, who sometimes is also the supervisor, but they're going to be a senior member of the staff at the absent voter counting board, and they're the one responsible for communicating with challengers. So when a challenger wants to challenge a process being used, they're going to do that to the challenger liaison, not to just any individual worker. Sequestration at the absent voter counting boards. So all individuals who are at the absent voter counting board, when counting starts that day, are sequestered, which means they are prohibited from leaving that location until polls close at 8 p.m. This is really important to note. If you want to be a challenger at a count board, or a poll worker at a count board, or even an election worker, once counting has started, you must remain in that location until 8 p.m. when polls close. This is really to ensure that no potential sharing of results is happening before the polls close. When you are in the absent voter counting board, there is a ban on any electronic devices. So aside from those being used for official counting purposes, but so there's no use of cell phones, tablets, laptops, that's all prohibited unless these were devices issued by the election commission for the purpose of counting the votes. If absentee ballot processing and tabulation continues after the polls close, challengers are permitted and poll watchers are permitted to remain there, but as soon as it hits 8 p.m. on election day, they are free to leave at that point. There's no more sequestration in effect, so you can leave, but you are permitted to stay if you want to continue watching the process. And as we know, counting can often go late into the evenings, given the number of absentee ballots cast. So this includes absent voter counting boards with multiple shifts. So you may be an election worker working at a counting board who only has to work a few shifts. When you're off shift, for instance, if you need lunch or a break, you can do so, but you still must remain in the location where counting is happening. You cannot leave during that break. So absent voter counting board, challengers versus observers or poll watchers. These two entities or individuals can also be at a polling place. And so they're very similar to how it's run at a polling location. Challengers have the right to be present and to challenge any processes that are taking place at that count board. They're allowed to be where the votes are being removed from envelopes and tabulated. So they can actually firsthand observe the process. Poll watchers, they cannot challenge the process, but they can watch. They may be a little bit further removed than challengers. They may not be able to get up close, but that's up to the clerk to define where they can be, depending on the size of the location. But challengers have a right to actually view how these processes are occurring. Neither of these individuals can speak directly to voters. You won't have voters at an absent vote counting board, but they also can't talk to election inspectors. Challengers, like I mentioned before, can only communicate with the challenger liaison, or if the challenger liaison designates a second individual, that individual as well. Both of these individuals are subject to that sequestration we just talked about, and they are stuck in that location until 8 p.m. on election day. But again, they have the right to stay there after 8 p.m. if counting is still occurring. And then both are required to sign an oath if you're at the absent voter counting board. So this oath confirms that you're not going to communicate any information about the counting of votes until after the polls close. At the beginning of counting, the supervisor at the location or the local clerk will administer that oath to all challengers and poll watchers in the counting board. So challenging at an absent voter counting board, what does that look like? If a challenger can demonstrate good cause to challenge a process, they may do so with the challenger liaison. The process is the same at absent voter counting boards as it is at a polling place. So if the challenge is permissible, the substance and time of the challenge, as well as the name of the challenger and the resolution, all must be recorded in the poll book. If the challenge is rejected, the reason for the determination must also be recorded in the poll book. Once at an absent voter counting board, challenges cannot be made to the absent voter's signature or eligibility, because that will likely have already been verified by the local clerk's office. If the challenger has reason to believe that that did not occur, for instance, the clerk did not sign the certificate that they must on the outside of the envelope, they can challenge the process in that way, but the signature and eligibility were already determined by the local clerks before those ballots were sent to the counting board. So that's the reason that challenging is to procedural issues once at the count board. If an absentee ballot can't be tabulated, what happens? So occasionally a ballot could be rejected due to what's called a false read, which is typically a stray mark or some type of stain on the ballot. If a ballot is rejected by the tabulator, first it must be visually inspected and looked at by an election worker to determine why it was denied by the tabulator. If the ballot was rejected due to a false read, the voters' selections will be duplicated on an additional ballot by 2 election workers, and those 2 election workers must have expressed the preference for different political parties. So it cannot be 2 members of the same political party duplicating a ballot. Duplications cannot be made until after polls close at 8 p.m. at a polling place, and the ballot cannot be tabulated and the ballot that cannot be tabulated. So the one with the false read must be placed in the auxiliary bin. So the clean version that was duplicated will be fed through the tabulator, and that marked copy will be saved in the auxiliary bin as well. Duplications can be made at any time at an absent voter counting board. And then challengers and poll watchers who are present can again watch this process occur. And if a challenger has good cause, they could challenge the procedure, for instance, if it's not two members of different political parties. So that's the counting. And then what happens with reporting results? The absent voter counting boards securely report their results, and it is separate from the results that are reported from polling places. So transparency at absent voter counting boards. There's public observation. So again, election challengers, poll workers, observers may serve at the counting boards to observe the process. And like we've mentioned a few times, they must comply with the sequestering requirements. There's no exception to that. Election officials have the authority to eject an unruly observer or challenger to complete the closing process without disruption or distraction. If you are ejected from an absent voter counting board before 8 p.m. on election day, clerks are directed that you still must be sequestered, just in a separate room or location from where the counting is taking place. So if there's a separate room in the building, it would be there, but you are still under those sequestering guidelines. You cannot have electronic devices if you've been ejected until that 8 p.m. close of polls. There's also partisan representation. These count boards must be staffed by at least one election worker from each political party. And partisan balance is something that clerks are advised that they should be attempting to achieve whenever possible when staffing their absent voter counting boards. So they want to have diverse representation, but at least one from each major political party. So the technology is secure. Just like at a standard polling location, ballot tabulators and e-poll books are not connected to the internet on election day. The internet is only used by the clerks when uploading unofficial election results to their county websites for the public to view. And the same processes take place at an absent voter counting board to tabulate absentee ballots as would be used in a polling location. So just because a county or city has established a counting board does not mean that they are using different processes for tabulating the votes. Aside from having to first remove the absentee ballot from the return envelope, they're going to conduct the process in a similar manner. And again, only deputized election officials can handle absentee ballots. And this goes for at any time in the process, whether it's voted or not, but only these deputized election officials can handle them once they're received to the clerk's office for processing. So why do some absent voter counting boards count ballots overnight? Absentee ballots take more time to securely check, process, and count than ballots cast in person at polling places. Unlike in other states like Florida, for instance, Michigan election officials are required to wait to begin tabulating until 7 a.m. on election day. Other states allow for pre-processing. Michigan does not have that at this time. As a result, absent voter counting boards may still be counting well into the night and sometimes the next day. And this is to ensure that all votes are tabulated, especially with the increase in absentee voters since 2020. we want to make sure that every vote counts. And so that's going to take more time to ensure that all of these votes are processed in the way that's prescribed to the clerks. This means that some communities may not see unofficial election results until the day after an election, or sometimes multiple days after the election, depending on the number of absentee ballots that are cast and how quickly they can be processed. How are absent vote counting board counts factored into the election result? So the counting board results are reported by precinct, and results are then added to the precinct's unofficial count. The absent voter counting board results are not final until all ballots have been counted, including those that were returned until 8 p.m. on election day. Again, if your absentee ballot is not there by 8 p.m. on election day, it cannot be counted. But if someone delivers their ballot at 7:59 on election day, that still has to go through the same process as every other absentee ballot that was cast. And so for this reason, the unofficial results may change after the polling place numbers are reported, because the polling place is going to report their numbers, and then the absent voter counting board will report their unofficial results, and those will be added together for the precinct's unofficial count. So it might change. Election results must be certified by the County Board of Canvassers and then the Board of State Canvassers before they are official. Per state law, each of these boards, the county and the state canvassers, are comprised of 4 members, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, so they are bipartisan. And then how do you make sure that your vote counts? What can you do going forward to make sure that this is a free, fair, and secure election? So first, return your ballot by mail or submit it to a drop box or your local clerk's office, and ensure that it's received by 8 p.m. on election day. Any votes coming in after 8 p.m. cannot count. So make sure your vote is there before 8 p.m. on election day. Expect that unofficial election results will come later on election night, or possibly a day or days after the election. And later results are a sign that the absent voter counting board are doing their job fairly, accurately, and securely. They're making sure that all of those votes that came in up until 8 p.m. on election day are counted. And then share accurate information. And remember that all results are unofficial until certified. So absent voter counting boards are secure, and they practice strict protocols to ensure that all votes are counted freely, fairly, and securely. And then they are canvassed and certified by the Board of State Canvassers and the county boards of canvassers.
Thank you, Megan, for all that great information. Now it's time for our Q&A. So first question, why aren't all election results announced on election night?
So I think we've covered this a little bit, but absentee ballots take more time to securely check, process, and count than ballots that are cast in person at a polling place. The signature on the outside of the envelope has to be checked, and they have to be opened. They can't be processed before election day. So there's lots of reasons that this takes longer. The Michigan legislature is the body that determines the legality and the allowance of any pre-processing that the clerks may be able to do with ballots. Currently, the legislature does not provide any time for pre-processing, and this is why other states like Florida are able to get their results more quickly than Michigan, because in their state, they can process before election day. Additionally, many smaller jurisdictions with fewer voters report their results on election night because they have fewer ballots to count. However, larger jurisdictions take much longer to count absentee ballots because they have a higher volume to process. Additionally, in many larger jurisdictions, absentee ballots that arrive on election day by 8 p.m. are put through the security checks at the clerk's office prior to going to the absent voter counting boards. So there's that additional step of signature verification, ballot number checking that takes place at the clerk's office before it can be brought over to the counting board for tabulation. If a ballot arrived at the clerk's office at 8 p.m., it may not move through the process and be sent to the counting board for several hours. So this is another reason why it takes longer in larger jurisdictions, especially when there's a high volume of absentee ballots being cast.
Okay, Megan, you may have already answered this earlier, but I think this question needs to serve as a reminder for folks online. Why can't clerks count absentee ballots before Election Day?
So again, this is a state law that's in place. The Michigan legislature is the only people that can change that, and they're the only ones that can approve some type of pre-processing. Currently, that is not allowed. The legislature is currently considering a change to state law that would allow clerks to pre-process absentee ballots, but it's unclear at this point whether that legislation would be passed or enacted prior to the November election. So at this point, clerks are prepared for no pre-processing time.
Okay, next question. What if you spell a write-in candidate's name incorrectly? Will your vote still count?
So this goes whether you're an absentee voter or an in-person voter. Election inspectors are instructed that they must write down and tally every name variation that comes in as a write-in vote. And then the Board of County Canvassers will determine what variations will count for a particular candidate. For example, if a voter wrote in J. Doe or Jane Doe or Jane D or Jane DOUGH, then the canvassers look at all of those variations and determine what the voter intended to vote and whether or not it will count.
All right, so next question. What is an election commission?
So we used this term a few times throughout the presentation. Each county has a county election commission with the chief judge of the probate or county of the county, the probate judge of the county or probate court for the district. It also has the county clerk and the county treasurer, and this commission ensures that election supplies are provided, including ballots for federal, state, and county elections. A city or township also has an election commission that determines precinct boundaries, assesses the voting equipment that's needed, provides voting supplies and ballots for elections, and they're responsible for appointing the precinct inspectors, so the election inspectors that'll work at each precinct.
All right. Next question. Can a ballot be challenged at a counting board?
So yes, because of the process for reviewing challenges to a voter's eligibility cannot be challenged at the absent voter counting board. Those must be made at in-person polling locations at the time the challenged voter is voting. The voter then has to be sworn in to answer questions to determine whether or not that vote is going to be, or that challenge is going to be accepted or not. So voter eligibility challenges are not permissible at the absent voter counting boards because that verification of the signature and the voter's eligibility has already taken place at a clerk's office, and the clerk has to sign off on the outside of the envelope that they've done that verification. But a challenger can challenge a voting process. So this includes the way election inspectors are operating a polling place or the absent voter counting boards. A challenge to an election process has to state the specific element or elements of the process that the challenger believes are being improperly performed and the basis for this belief. And a permissible challenge to an election process will be accepted if the challenger liaison determines that a challenger is correct and that the specific element or elements of the election process are not being carried out in accordance with state law. So the challenger liaison shall inform the workers doing that part of the process how to properly carry out the process going forward and take any other remedial actions that may be necessary to correct the error. So that type of process, procedural challenge can take place at a counting board.
Okay, why would election challengers or poll watchers not be admitted into or be ejected from a counting board?
So a challenger has to be credentialed by a credentialing organization, and a credentialing organization may field no more than the number of challengers set out by the clerk's office. So that must be specified. And if a credentialing organization already has the total number of challengers allowed in a particular location, additional challengers credentialed by that organization cannot serve in that location. They would need to go to a different location. At the clerk or the challenger liaison's discretion, additional challengers seeking to access the location may be given the option to serve as a poll watcher, but in that case, they would not be able to challenge anything taking place. Challengers who agree to act as poll watchers have none of the rights specifically afforded to challengers, and they must work as a poll watcher and follow those guidelines. Generally, a credentialing organization will be allowed to replace challengers credentialed by that organization, so long as it doesn't disrupt the election workers. However, because of the sequestration that takes place at absent voter counting boards, you cannot swap in and out challengers at an absent voting counter board. If you're there, the challenger for an organization, when counting takes place, you are going to be the challenger that has to remain there until 8 p.m. and the close of polls. So that's why someone may not be allowed in. Someone may be ejected for repeatedly failing to follow instructions or directions set out by election inspectors. So if you're specifically going in to disrupt the process or the piece, then you will be ejected. And again, if you're at an absent voter counting board, ejection doesn't mean you just get to leave the building. You will be sequestered in another room at that location where counting is not taking place. If a worker is trying to eject a poll watcher or challenger and they refuse to leave, then law enforcement will likely become involved to assist in that case.
Okay, Megan, I think we have time for one more question. And that question is, are ballots allowed to be edited or recreated on a new ballot at a counting board?
So as we discussed under the Michigan election law, an election inspector may duplicate a ballot if there are stray marks, if it's crumpled, if there's a reason that the ballot cannot be processed by the tabulator, but the votes are not changed from the voter selections. They must be duplicated identically, and two elections inspectors affiliating with different parties, for example, one Republican and one Democrat, must observe this duplication process. So there must be differing parties that are observing that process to ensure that the ballot is being duplicated accurately.
Okay, actually, we have a couple more questions that we received in the Q&A that I'm going to fire off to you. Next one is, how can I sign up to count absentee ballots?
So you can sign up to serve as an election inspector by visiting michigan.gov/democracymvp, and you would need to complete the election inspector interest form. You can also contact your local clerk's office directly to apply. If contacted and hired by a clerk, you can let the clerk know your preference to work in a counting board. However, not all jurisdictions have counting boards, and clerks in Democracy MVP cannot guarantee your placement at counting board, so you may end up in a precinct. All election inspectors are hired and placed at the clerk's discretion.
Okay, great. Next question. Is a challenger allowed to ask questions to any election inspector or only the challenger liaison? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I cut you off. I apologize, Neva.
Not issue a challenge, but to talk to or ask a question.
So challengers may only speak to the challenger liaison at a counting board, or someone the challenger liaison delegates if they need to take part in a different part of the process. But any questions, any challenges, any type of communication can only take place with the challenger liaison or a designee of the challenger liaison.
Okay, and our last question in the Q&A, would it be an accurate understanding that the prohibition of electronic devices applies to both challengers and inspectors?
So challengers are prohibited from using video cameras or recording devices in the polling place, including a camera or recording features of a smartphone or tablet. Challengers are also prohibited from using iPhones, laptops, tablets, or other electronic devices in the absent voter counting board. And challengers who serve in the counting board, again, are remaining in that counting board until 8 p.m. when polls close. If a challenger sees other observers using their phones or electronic recording devices, they should alert a precinct chairperson.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for all that wonderful information. I am hoping that everyone who participated today learned a lot and feel more empowered than they did before they joined. So everyone, thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to sign up for next week's edition of My Vote Counts. Until then, take care and have a wonderful week.